Afrocentrics are in full-throttle panic mode, working overtime to soothe their coping anxiety and fears over the latest findings of the Old Kingdom NUE001 sample, just another example among mounting evidence which upends the entire Black Egypt narrative. The broader implications of this finding extends beyond Egypt, effectively dismantling other related falsehoods, and since Afrocentrics can't claim the crowning glory of ancient Egypt, they are left with nothing. Bogus claims of Black African origins for populations outside Sub-Sahara, such as Natufians, Mesopotamians, Minoans, Greeks, Romans, Etruscans, Vikings, European royalty, Olmecs, Native Americans, or Japanese samurai, and other such egregious instances of cultural hijackings and misrepresentations are effectively dismissed by the overwhelming and consistent genetic, cranial, and dental evidence across hundreds of peer-reviewed studies. This latest dataset only reinforces a pattern already established in the literature. The full Neolithic cultural package, including pastoralism, agriculture, the sickle, the Helwan point, the potter's wheel, beer, wine, etc., entered Egypt via Eurasian populations. Domesticated animals such as sheep, goats, swine, and cattle are not indigenous to sub-Saharan Africa, but were introduced by Eurasians migrating into the continent. The fully sequenced genome of sample NUE001 confirms affinity with Levantine and North African populations, directly contradicting the Black Egypt narrative. Cranial and dental traits further support this genetic profile. At this point, clinging to outdated and unsupported claims amounts to little more than denial in the face of overwhelming evidence. With this new revelation in regard to the Old Kingdom individual backed by comprehensive craniometric, dental, and full genome-wide sequence, the scope of ancient Egypt's ancestral links become more confirmed and more constrained by hard data. It underscores the necessity of grounding historical interpretation in scientific evidence rather than ideological narratives or cultural appropriation. Journey with me as we travel through and explore the dank, dark, never-ending Afrocentric rabbit hole of cope.
Okay, so biological affinity. Okay, so let's read from here. The genetic ancestry of the individual has been determined. Okay, now first of all, no, it hasn't. Okay, you haven't determined his ancestry, and you're going to see how far they are from determining his ancestry as we go on. Okay, you can say it's been collected, you can say he's been sampled, but you certainly can't say that his ancestry has been determined, because ancestry says we know exactly where he came from. That's a load of crap. You have no idea. You have no idea where his ancestry comes from. We just don't have enough ancient DNA to.
Denial. His statement is not only questionable but also self-contradictory and baseless. The complete genome sequence of NUE001 clearly disproves his claim. As the first whole genome from an Old Kingdom individual, its results didn't match his expectations, hence his retreat into denial and misrepresentation. The paper clearly states the individual's ancestry has been determined, meaning we know which populations he shares the closest genetic affinity with. Did you catch his deceitful tactic? He's twisting this into a false narrative, pretending the study pinpoints the exact village this person's ancestors came from. It does no such thing. The genetic profile shows nearest neighbor affinity, not pinpoint origin. Yet with zero evidence and no PhD or master's, this charlatan claims to know exactly where this individual came from. It's far more likely the individual lived his entire life in Egypt, with ancestral roots stretching back hundreds or even thousands of years within Egypt. The very fact that NUE001's genome has been sequenced is the entire premise why this fraud is arguing against it. Let that sink in.
The Lakish were dark-skinned and phenotypically African. We know that's probably the case.
Oh, you know this, do you? Then by all means, cite the study that supports this accusation. Otherwise, this assertion is nothing more than empty rhetoric, driven by spite, envy, and a generous dose of wishful thinking. Simply asserting something doesn't make it true. This is how Afrocentrics sidestep cranially distinct populations that don't cluster with sub-Saharans. They dismiss, distort, or simply ignore the evidence so everyone magically becomes black in La La Land. Lachich clusters with European phenotype. In contrast to his assertion, we have concrete data. The Iron Age Lakish male was phenotypically West Eurasian Caucasoid since he ranks among NUE001's top 5 closest phenotypic matches, as NUE001 himself was classified as West Eurasian phenotype or otherwise Caucasoid. We know for a fact that Iron Age Lachish shows clear continuity with its Bronze Age predecessor, reflecting biological continuity within the broader Mediterranean region. The samples demonstrate phenotypic ties to North African and European populations, with especially close affinity to Egyptian and Phoenician groups. What peer-reviewed data does TKM present to directly refute this data while simultaneously supporting his claims? None. Again, this is desperate run-of-mouth cope.
We know any of these kind of like old Neolithic samples, you know, anything from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic, probably right up until quite recent, you're going to be dealing with black people across the Levant, the Arabian Peninsula.
Supercope. We're not dealing with any black people in the Levant, which is exactly why they don't cluster with black people. What we're dealing with is a pathological liar who thinks everyone is a mere recent phenomenon with no history. He's going to substantiate his claim with empirical evidence that demonstrates the presence of what he called phenotypically African, by which he means sub-Saharans, in the ancient Levant and Arabia, right? No? I didn't think so. It is yet another baseless, boastful, Afrocentric lie, and if he actually believed the nonsense he spews, he wouldn't be arguing against NUE001 having affinity with the Levant. Think about that. It is well documented in population genetics that ancient Mediterraneans and Near Eastern populations do not cluster with sub-Saharan populations on principal component analyses at any level, whether it be dental, cranial, or genetics. He's looking directly at one of these papers right now and still refuses to acknowledge its findings. The level of denial highlights an unwillingness to engage with the evidence objectively or realistically. His own ancestors, ancient or modern, don't cluster with ancient or modern North Africans, East Africans, or South Africans on PCA within Africa. They each form separate, distinct groups. Yet he wants his audience to believe sub-Saharans magically cluster with Eurasians outside of Africa, while not even clustering with other sub-Saharan populations inside sub-Sahara. That's a blatant contradiction and a clear attempt to mislead. Here's the full spectrum: Neolithic, Chalcolithic, and Bronze Age Levant. So why do these populations consistently fail to cluster with any ancient or modern black sub-Saharan groups, contrary to what this fraud claims? The genetic data shows a clear and consistent separation from sub-Saharans. He can't and won't explain it. Instead, fellow West Eurasians cluster precisely where they should alongside Copts, Egyptians, and Palestinians, because they're morphologically and genetically Caucasoid populations. In fact, this PCA serves as a perfect complement to the NUE001 study, reinforcing its conclusions with consistent population clustering patterns. And don't expect him to correct himself after seeing this. Facts are always disregarded when they conflict with Afrocentric narratives. On another note, why is it so effortless to present solid data like this PCA chart that consistently supports my claims and directly refutes his, yet he consistently fails to provide any evidence to support his own claims? He subjects his audience to unsubstantiated hearsay. That alone should make you think.
I guess that's our Keita East African, we have our Bushman, and we have our Zulu samples. So we have our 4 African samples there. Okay, so our 4 African. Now, you'll see that these crosses are new cranid samples when they wanted to bolster the database, yeah? Make it look a bit bigger. So what did? They added a whole bunch more non-Africans. Look how many Eurasians they added. 1, 2.
That's 5 African samples, not 4. Did he forget that Egypt is in Africa? Oddly enough, he never seemed bothered that the original CRANID database contained 5 African samples and only 3 European samples for decades. Not a word of objection. The database was expanded in 2012, adding even more samples, yet expresses no concern or objection until now. It's ironic. Most would welcome additional datasets as they make the findings more comprehensive and statistically reliable. He complains about there not being enough samples, but then denigrates the researchers for expanding the dataset, particularly with the inclusion of newly added Iron Age Lachish and India, of whom NUE001 shares affinity with. The inconsistency reveals that his frustration isn't about methodology, but about results that don't support his narrative. We have samples representing North, East, West and South Africa, virtually every major region. Adding more sub-Saharan samples won't change the results. The cranial patterns are consistent and well established. Notice there are no representative Arabian samples, yet there are 5 African samples. Did he ever complain about that? Of course not. It's a clear double standard and nothing more than performative outrage.
29 craniometric measurements, okay, and they've got them listed below, were taken of the NUE001 cranium for the CRANID program CR6B-IND. CRANID compares unknown individuals as 74 pre-modern through recent global samples, okay, 74 pre-modern through recent global samples.
That's 29 cranial measurements employed. I can't emphasize it enough. 29. That level of detail matters. Additionally, CRANID compares an unknown cranium with 74 geographic samples from 3,163 crania from 39 different populations. As a side, what I find extremely hypocritical is that the Afrocentric camp relies on and champions Keita's work to support their so-called Black Egypt narrative. Why? Because Keita often uses far fewer cranial metrics, sometimes less than half of the full set. By limiting the dataset, comparing Egyptians primarily to nearby East Africans and distant Northern Europeans while omitting geographically closer populations like North Africans, Southern Europeans or Levantines, Keita easily guides the results toward a predetermined conclusion. None of the genetic, dental, or cranial data on ancient Egypt aligns with Keita's conclusions. Perhaps this likely explains why many of his papers, once easily accessible, are now inaccessible. It's disgraceful. His approach undermines credible research and insults the intelligence of those who seek truth over ideology. Keita's work in this context undermines serious scholarship and insults the intelligence of those who value objective research. Using 29 cranial metric measurements yields a far more robust and reliable result than using the disgraceful 15 or fewer in conjunction with a few select cherry-picked populations.
Results from the linear discriminant function analysis in the program revealed that the NUE001 cranium most closely resembles, in descending order, a sample of Iron Age male crania from West Asia. Okay, so Iron Age male from West Asia, namely Lachish, Palestine, with a probability of group membership at 0.53. Okay, that's 53%. Sounds pretty high, yeah, pretty conclusive. Let's carry on. The female crania from that site at 0.254, okay, and an Egyptian from the 26th to the 30th dynasty sample of males at 0.175. So those three.
At this point, CRANID has already determined and confirmed NUE001's cranium shows no affinity with sub-Saharan populations. He has a lot of explaining to do. If NUE001 were truly of sub-Saharan origin, as he so desperately wants to believe, there would be no reason for the sample not to cluster with sub-Saharan populations, regardless of how many Eurasian samples are in the database. Yet, despite his insistence, NUE001 consistently clusters with Eurasian groups. With the publication of numerous PCAs on this topic over the years, he has not presented a single study that would find support for his claims. Not one. Is there any wonder? Unsurprisingly, he fails to explain this outcome, offering only excuses and complaints in place of evidence.
It should be noted that the relevant genetic findings in the main text neither Neolithic North African or other specific West Asian cranial samples are part of the cranid database. Now, this is really key, okay? Neither Neolithic North African nor other specific West Asian cranial samples, and might I add, nothing locally in Africa.
This point is critical as it demonstrates that even in the absence of certain samples, NUE001 consistently clusters with Eurasian populations rather than sub-Saharan groups that are present in the database. It also highlights that the existing East, West, and South African cranial samples are sufficiently representative even without the inclusion of North African crania, and shows a clear distinction. Additionally, the paper notes that in lieu of certain cranial samples not included in the program, available genetic data serves as a valuable tool to fill those gaps. Here again, we point out the hypocrisy that in promoting the so-called Black Egypt fallacy, Afrocentric's champion Keita, who consistently relies on a minimal set of cranial measurements, often between 9 to 15, compared to the 29 metrics used in the NUE001 study. Not only does he limit the data set in terms of measurements, but he also severely restricts the population samples he draws from. His analyses frequently exclude key regional populations such as North Africans, Levantines, Indians, Arabians, and other Egyptian crania available in collections. Instead, his studies often include distant Northern European populations like Norwegians and Hungarians alongside fully represented East, West, and South African groups. By avoiding regionally proximate populations like North Africans or Levantines and relying on a narrower, selective sample, 3 Europeans and 4 sub-Saharans, Keita's conclusions lack the comprehensive comparative context found in the NUE001 study, which, by contrast, employs a full 29 cranial measurements and includes a diverse, geographically relevant range of populations. Unsurprisingly, it arrives at an entirely different conclusion. Of course, Afrocentrists will never criticize Keita's selective use of minimal cranial measurements or the limited population samples in his now largely discredited studies.
Africans can have broad or narrow noses, this, that, and the other.
Let's be clear, West, Central, South, and some East Africans have a wide nasal aperture, while those with narrow nasal apertures are common among North Africans, Egyptians, and some East Africans who are admixed. Sub-Saharans do not possess the suite of characteristics seen in NUE001. Claiming otherwise is nothing more than his way of wedging a foot in the door to push the false narrative that ancient Egypt was black. It wasn't. Soon he will insist sub-Saharan blacks can magically have Caucasoid features such as straight hair and a variety of eye colors. They can't and don't. After that, it will be sub-Saharan blacks can have Eurasian DNA too. The cope never ends. In reality, this type of language is subconscious admittance that ancient Egypt was never a black civilization in the first place.
We share the more kind of quote-unquote stereotypical non-Eurasian,
and then wonders why sub-Saharans phenotypically don't place with Caucasoids on the dendrogram.
So when you cluster them on a dendrogram and your Bushman, Dogon, Zulu, and East African are all clustering phenotypically right next to each other, we already know what kind of Africans they selected for this database. This database was set up for no other reason than to say, hey, we did a comparison and hey, look.
Textbook denial. The fact that sub-Saharans cluster closest with sub-Saharans and West Eurasians cluster closest with West Eurasians both phenotypically and genetically is entirely expected and well documented. There is no valid reason why a genetically or phenotypically sub-Saharan individual would cluster with West Eurasians, and this deceitful individual won't present any evidence on the contrary because he knows there is no evidence to support it. This is big league cope. His position isn't grounded in science, but fantasy coupled with racist ideology. Moreover, phenotypical tree model clustering has proven to be a valuable and reliable method reflecting underlying genetic structure. The data fundamentally undermines his fabricated narrative, which is why we're witnessing emotional responses filled with denial, misdirection, and baseless accusations.
You've got someone who's a very typical Kenyan. Yeah, it's got to throw this completely off. They're going to be clustering. Who do you think they'll be clustering with?
The Taita are Kenyan, so it's unclear what exactly was thrown off. As expected, Kenyans cluster with other sub-Saharan samples, which logically aligns with their geographic and genetic background. Kenyans cluster with regional proximate populations because they share genetic affinities with them. This isn't rocket science. Why is he desperate to make Kenyans or any sub-Saharans cluster with Eurasians? If that's not convincing enough, we have both ancient and modern Kenyan populations projected on PCA alongside ancient Near Eastern samples. Notably, populations like Kenya Early Pastoral N and Kenya Pastoral Neolithic exhibit a clear Eurasian genetic component. This reflects admixture with ancestries from Northern Africa and the Levant, reinforcing the broader genetic connections between northeastern Africa and neighboring Levant. These people don't show any affinity with Eurasians today, as the Eurasian component has been largely diluted and replaced over time, leaving a completely different genetic profile from what existed in ancient populations. This would account for the narrow nose as observed in some East African populations. However, Afrocentrics always dismiss the well-documented presence of Eurasian genetic components in both ancient and modern East African populations that have managed to retain these components. So why insist on comparing East Africans to ancient Egyptians when East Africans are widely recognized as an admixed population with both sub-Saharan and Eurasian ancestry? There are obvious clear separations of African populations from different regions, with Eastern, Northern, Southern and Western African populations falling into the right, left and top corner of PC1, PC2 space respectively. Yet another defining example of why NURAT clusters with North African and Levantine populations on PCA rather than with sub-Saharan groups.
Anyone who's got, even myself, I'm pretty sure if my skull was inputted into this, I would probably cluster closer to some of these some of these non-African groups than to these African groups.
Utmost cringe. Is he really desperately trying to convince his audience that he somehow fits within a population he clearly does not belong? The cope is thick. The mere fact that he would make such a statement speaks volumes about the level of delusion and self-deception at play. His appearance does not align with that of Mediterraneans, Levantines, ancient Egyptians. He clearly has West African sub-Saharan morphology, yet is putting himself ahead of East Africans like Somalis, who are admixed with Eurasian, and therefore pushes a narrative completely detached from reality. Is he offended by his phenotype, hence off-the-cuff remarks? As clearly shown in the chart before him, plain as day, sub-Saharan populations cluster with other sub-Saharans, not with non-African populations as distinct as Australian Aboriginals.
And there's a reason why they went back to this 1980s outdated database to prove their point.
There's nothing outdated about the CRANID software program. It functions by inputting 29 standardized cranial measurements and assigning likely population affinity. It was developed in the 1990s, not 1980s, and was expanded in 2012 with a larger reference database, including more global samples, further enhancing its robustness. While not the dominant method in anthropological research today, CRANID has been employed in dozens of peer-reviewed forensic and anthropological studies since its inception.
This is not scholarship any way, shape, or form. This is a joke. Okay? This is
It's not surprising to hear dismissal coming from a keyboard warrior who selectively challenges scholarship when results undermine his narratives. And let me tell you, they constantly undermine his narratives. The Black Egypt cult labels anything they don't like as flawed, biased, joke, etc. Yet, had the data aligned with his desired narrative, TKM would be praising the authors and their methodology without hesitation or scrutiny.
one-sided or heavily weighted towards Eurasians, as you saw that database was, the more likely you're going to find someone who you cluster closely within that group.
So when Cranid included 5 African samples compared to only 3 European ones, is that how Cater arrived at the Badarian remains as having sub-Saharan affinities? Could it be that the sample distribution skewed the results towards sub-Saharan populations simply due to their greater representation in the data set? Is that why Cater was wrong all these years? This is the type logic TKM is using, and based on his statement, he would be forced to admit Cater is wrong. But we know the reality is more complex than just sample counts. Population affinity isn't solely determined by the number of samples in a database, it also depends on actual cranial measurements.
And we already know, I mean, I can just look at that and see that's a long that's a long femur. Okay, you can just look at that and see that straight away, or tibia. I can't remember which is which.
Did you catch that? He literally just called the shin bone the femur. He can't distinguish between the tibia and the femur, and this comes immediately after lecturing his audience distal segments are longer than proximal segments. Unbelievable. He can just look at that and tell you the wrong information like it's fact. And let's not confuse him with the fibula.
They have done their best once again to do their tilty thing. Okay, fade out the skull top. He's prognathic as well. Let me make that very, very clear. He's mildly prognathic, but he's definitely prognatic. They've tilted the skull forward to hide the prognathism. You can always tell.
To hide prognathism? No one takes these jokesters serious. Accusing the photographer of deliberately hiding the skull's supposed prognathism is laughable to anyone familiar with basic anatomy, as if tilting the skull slightly would somehow conceal a major structural trait. Observers can assess the skull as it appears, and there's no visible evidence of double maxillary prognathism, a key indicator of sub-Saharan ancestry. Out of desperation, he's now trying to convince his audience that simply tilting the head upward will magically reveal prognathism that isn't otherwise apparent. You honestly just have to laugh.
To hide the prognathism, you can always tell because this bone here, the zygomatic major, should really be horizontal.
Wrong. It's not called the zygomatic major when referring to skeletal anatomy. When examining a skull, the correct term is zygomatic bone or zygomatic arch. The zygomaticus major is a soft tissue muscle, it's not bone. The zygomaticus major stretches from the zygomatic bone to the corner of the mouth and plays a role in facial expressions such as smiling. Using the muscular term in the context of a dry skull is anatomically incorrect.
Okay, most human beings, the zygomatic major is pretty much a horizontal plane, and that's how you can make sure that you've rendered.
He doesn't know the difference between the zygomatic bone and the zygomaticus major, just like he doesn't know the difference between the femur and the tibia. It's one anatomical blunder after another, yet he speaks with the confidence of an expert. You really can't make this stuff up.
If that was horizontal, then you can jut that jaw forward, about an inch, okay? And then you have the true expression of what his prognathism looks like. But anyway, we don't need to go into that too much.
Not go into it too much. Oh, we're going to get into it very much. In fact, we're going to play his little game and see if this supposed prognathism suddenly appears and at what degree. Here we are. Pay close attention to that magical prognathism. Don't blink or you might miss it. Did you see it? Neither did I. No magic, no mystery, just a standard orthognathic dental occlusion, exactly as expected. Clearly textbook Afrocentric distraction tactics. Oh yes, let's shift the focus to the bone I repeatedly misidentify as a muscle, so we can avoid discussing the real issue as to why the skull profile completely lacks the prognathism I constantly hype up in my videos as a defining sub-Saharan trait somehow, someway, proving ancient Egyptians were black. Let me introduce you to two examples that TKM claims represent the typically African and typically Eurasian skull types. I'm confident that after this exercise, he'll think twice before plastering skulls all over his videos again. As a side, I want to point out that his so-called typically African is, in all actuality, modeled after a black American, so he deceived his audience, but for the sake of argument, we'll play along. As you can see, TKM labelled one skull as typically African, by which he really means sub-Saharan or Negroid. The other he labelled typically Eurasian, though what he actually means is Caucasoid. We'll use his own examples as the standard of comparison. It should be immediately obvious at first glance which category the Old Kingdom Egyptian falls into. Is NUE001 any more prognathic than his typical Eurasian example? Certainly not, and he doesn't come anywhere close to matching the degree of prognathism seen in his sub-Saharan example. By now, it should be clear why Cranid grouped NUE001 with other Caucasoid skulls, such as those from Iron Age Lachish and 26th-30th dynasty Egyptians. As stated. Thus, in line with the genetic results, the NUE001 individual appears most akin phenotypically to Western Eurasians rather than sub-Saharan Africans dentally, and more specifically pre-modern West Asians, such as Lachish, based on craniometrics. It is secondarily most similar in craniometric dimensions to ancient Egyptians of a more recent time. As Caroline Wilkinson states, the teeth demonstrated normal occlusion. Normal occlusion refers to the proper alignment and relationship of the teeth when the jaws are closed. In this arrangement, the upper teeth slightly overlap the lower teeth, and the bite is balanced. Normal occlusion is typically associated with an orthognathic flat or straight facial profile. This stands in stark contrast to prognathism, where both the upper and lower jaws protrude beyond the natural facial profile. NUE001 expresses an orthognathic profile, not double maxillary prognathism. Why stop at prognathism? We will circle back to this later in the video.
In a very paper where they're trying to deny the Africanity of this man.
The paper explicitly states that this man is Eurasian cranially, dentally, and genetically, yet he's still flailing in full-blown denial, desperately coping to avoid the reality of NUE001's identity.
Even the artifacts are staring back at them and saying, hey, what are you really gonna insist that these people being depicted here are not Africans? Are you really gonna insist that? The artwork is literally staring back at you.
By the same standard, one could just as easily argue that the figures at the bottom are white, but he'd call that ridiculous for relying on the exact same flawed reasoning he just used. So here we are. For context, the first image is not an original, but a sketch from 1893 found in Newbury's Beni Hassan. The sketch beneath is from Norman de Gary Davies' The Tomb of Khenamun at Thebes, 1930. The tactic is to strip ancient Egyptians of their unique heritage by lumping them in with sub-Saharans under the blanket label African. Ancient Egyptians felt no sense of kinship with populations to the south, whom they consistently depicted with features distinct from their own. Their mummified remains further confirm these physical differences. The Egyptians clearly recognized cultural and racial boundaries and formally established a southern border by their own reckoning at Aswan.
Physically, if you measure his bones, he is proportionate to a Black American. This
super negroids. This is the holy grail among Afrocentrics and admittedly one of my favorites to debunk. Limb length ratios are based on Trotter and Gleaser 1952, but he is calling the updated CRANI-D program from 2012 outdated. Isn't that something? He thinks this is a win-win while conveniently ignoring the mountain of other data. It's not. Notice they use Black Americans, not actual sub-Saharans in sub-Sahara. There's a reason for that. US blacks are admixed with Northern European whites. Oh yes, US blacks are sometimes used by American anthropologists as representatives of a tropical body build, yet in many respects they are intermediate in morphology between native sub-Saharan Africans and Northern European Americans. Limb ratios have no bearing on crania, dental, and genetics. As stated by Zakrzewski, ancient Egyptians have a shorter tibia in relation to the femur. Populations with a shorter tibia relative to the femur are cold adapted. By contrast, sub-Saharan populations exhibit a longer tibia to femur ratio, a trait associated with tropical adaptation. By definition, this anatomical pattern excludes sub-Saharan populations from being considered cold adapted. Nubians settled in and occupied the village of Gebeline during the Middle Kingdom. Their limb ratios were longer than those of pre-dynastic and Old Kingdom Egyptians. This directly undermines the Afrocentric claim that Egyptian limb ratios were essentially the same or similar to Nubians or sub-Saharans from the Congo or farther south. Limb proportion data follows Allen's rule, showing that Egyptians adapted to a warm, sunny climate, but not an equatorial, humid climate. Longer limbs than cooler climate Northern Europeans, but shorter than Nubians. Essentially, as Zakrzewski stated, they have a shorter tibia in relation to the femur. They would have resembled geoproximate Mediterranean, Levantine, and Arabian populations on the same latitude, and yet none of these populations were used in the analysis. If ancient Egyptians were supposedly black Africans, they wouldn't become increasingly African. The explanation is straightforward. It's evidence that the Middle Kingdom Gebeline sample included Nubians. As cited in the NUE001 paper, Raxter wraps it up nicely. Longbone stature estimation equations derived from ancient Egyptian skeletal samples produce more consistently accurate stature estimates for ancient Egyptians than do regression formulas based on American black reference populations. This makes sense methodologically. Formulas work best when the reference population closely matches the target population in body proportions. Since ancient Egyptians had limb ratios intermediate between Northern Europeans and Nubians, American black formulas, which are based on an admixed population with somewhat different proportions, introduce more error, while equations built from actual ancient Egyptian data fit their morphology better. And there it is. American blacks were used as a reference population. The authors never assert or make a case that the ancient Egyptians were black Americans or vice versa, but rather use black Americans as a comparative stand-in population, even thought they are not identical. Why? Because black Americans are admixed with Northern European Americans, and thus is a methodological choice based on available datasets, not an assertion of shared ancestry. Comparative populations are proxies, not equivalents. Limb length ratios are representative of latitude. Egypt falls in the northern hemisphere between the Arctic Circle and Tropic of Cancer, closer to European, Mediterranean, and Levantine populations, while sub-Saharans fall below the Tropic of Cancer and are an equatorial population. Hence why ancient Egyptians have a shorter tibia in relation to the femur, while sub-Saharans have a longer tibia in relation to the femur. And because American blacks are admixed with American whites, it places Egyptians ratio-wise in the middle. And then we have Blues et al. They make it clear that categorizing ancient Egyptians as tropically adapted, super negroid or negroid, is a gross mischaracterization of the evidence, and that it may additionally obscure localized adaptations within larger geographical areas. Which brings us full circle to Robbins and Shute, who coined the term super negroid. What did they say? This does not mean that the ancient Egyptians were Negroes. Indeed, in their art, they clearly distinguished between their own facial features and skin color and those of people from further south.
Yeah, there's more. There's more. There's a lot of deception on this paper.
That's him blatantly scrolling past, willfully, deliberately, spitefully, ignoring craniometric and dental measurements proving NUE001's West Eurasian morphological standing. He won't even glance at it, let alone address it. This is confirmation bias in its purest, most pathetic form, desperately cherry-picking scraps that prop up his delusions while running from the overwhelming evidence against him, and then has the nerve to concoct a ridiculous supposed reconstruction based on sheer fantasy. This is the cope of Afrocentrism.
Basically, he clusters as black. This is kind of what they wrote. He clusters as black, but
Based on what? According to who? Absolutely laughable. He runs from the mountain of evidence that shreds his case. Lie after lie. Nowhere do the authors say quote-unquote clusters with black. Anyone that knows how to read sees the authors stated the exact opposite. This is a major exercise in cope and full-blown self-delusion.
Hypersplex model, I believe, the Hypersplex DNA analysis, okay? The Hypersplex model clearly states the eye color, the skin color, and hair color based on probability. There was no evidence in relation to eye color, skin color, and hair color.
The authors acknowledge the limited accuracy of phenotypic predictions in understudied populations using the Hypersplex S system. They stated, although acknowledging known limitations in predicting phenotypic traits in understudied populations, the NUE001 individual is predicted to have had brown eyes, brown hair, and skin pigmentation ranging from dark to black with a lower probability of intermediate skin color. The predicted skin tone for the NUE001 individual indicates a 56.78% probability of dark skin, outweighing any likelihood of black sub-Saharan pigmentation. This aligns with North African and West Eurasian populations, not sub-Saharans. Notably, this prediction is based on an incomplete SNP profile, with several markers missing, so the estimate remains conservative and explains why the facial reconstruction was produced in grayscale without eye color, hair color, or skin color. Wouldn't the Old Kingdom NUE001 individual closely resemble his Egyptian contemporaries? Isn't that the most logical explanation? Doesn't that make complete sense? If Afrocentrics continue to insist that the Egyptians were black, then one only needs to turn to the Egyptians' own artwork. The artisans clearly distinguished nilotic groups with black pigmentation, unique hairstyles, and distinct facial profiles. Egyptians, in contrast, consistently depicted themselves with lighter reddish tones, different craniofacial features, and attire unique to their culture. The contrast was deliberate and repeated across centuries, showing that Egyptians did not consider themselves black in the same sense as their Nilotic southern neighbors. Egyptians themselves made the difference clear. This cultural and artistic differentiation aligns with the biological evidence. The NUE001 genome confirms this separation genetically. QPADM modeling repeatedly rejects East African or sub-Saharan sources as best fits, instead placing Egyptians with North African, Middle Neolithic, and West Eurasian related ancestry. NUE001's haplogroups mtDNA N1A1B2 and yDNA E1B1B1B2B are most common in North Africa and West Asia, not in Sub-Sahara. Phenotypically, Hypersplex S analysis gave the highest probability for dark but not black skin, alongside brown eyes and brown hair, in line with modern North Africans, not Nilotics. Can you spot the invader? Even die-hard Afrocentrics have to take a step back on this one. Look at how his fraudulent reconstruction exposed him, and in the process he exposed himself. He essentially ruined it for so-called Black Egypt. Here we are using his phony recreation as a standard of measure against actual Egyptian statuary, which would be NUE001's contemporaries. Compare and contrast always destroys Afrocentrism. What an eye-opener. He's trying to turn them into Bantus. In an act of desperation, he will reduce himself to labeling authentic Egyptian masterpieces as fake. He claims that ancient Egyptians had coiled or kinky hair that was supposedly straightened after death. An absurd notion. Statues show no such traits, and the hair is consistently straight, just as we observe in the mummies themselves. His caricature is entirely fraudulent. Here are a range of Egyptian skin tones. Notice none are black. The fact that the Egyptian with the lightest skin tone has the same hair type and identical facial features as those with intermediate and darker skin tones indicates they are Caucasoid. Furthermore, there is no tightly coiled hair present. This is why TKM's phony reconstruction falls flat on its face. Spot the Egyptians. How many do you see?
The skull was dolichocephalic and exhibited post-bregmatic depression. Has she not talked about what dolichocephaly and post-bregmatic depression is indicative of? I'm sure you guys have got a good idea about which populations have dolichocephaly and post-bregmatic depression. And she knows this as well because she said it in a video. She's talked about the fact that these traits are associated with Africans. Okay, left it out.
We're certain his audience is both misled and duped, especially since he deliberately left out the part where Caroline Wilkinson stated the trait is also found in Europeans. Here's what this fraud didn't want them to hear.
The distance from the forehead to the back of the skull is long in relation to the overall height of the cranium, and that's something that you see quite frequently in certain populations, one of which is ancient Egyptians. Another would be Black African groups, well, also certain populations, one of which is ancient Egyptians. Another would be Black African groups.
Ancient Egyptians, Black African groups.
But some scholars now believe Cleopatra and her siblings had African blood. Could the answer be in this skull?
The distance from the forehead to the back of the skull is long in relation to the overall height of the cranium, and that's something that you see quite frequently in certain populations, one of which is ancient Egyptians. Another would be Black African groups, will also show that characteristic. This one certainly looks more white European. This one certainly looks more white European.
And let's not forget his own source, Raymond Dart, clearly stated this trait is found among Europeans, including Mediterraneans. Additionally, TKM lied to his audience, insisting the supposed skull of Arsinoe belonged to a sub-Saharan woman, when in fact it was that of a European boy. Did he ever retract his lies? Did he ever apologize for deceiving his audience? No, of course not, and he never will. Post-bregmatic depression is a non-metric cranial trait found across all major populations, so its value as a definitive racial marker is meaningless. Next.
The square orbit suggested slight upturned fissures.
In the sub-Saharan skull, his source states the orbits are rectangular, not square. In the Caucasian and NUE001 skulls, his source states they are circular with squared margins. Squared margins.
The nasal spine and nasal bone suggested an upturned nose with a rounded allay. That's the outside of your nostrils, guys. Yeah. Upturned nose, rounded allay, concave dorsal ridge.
Upturned nose, rounded alae, and concave dorsal ridge. Here are some examples. Oh, and did we forget to mention Eurasian DNA? In the sub-Saharan skull, the lower part of the nasal aperture has a bilateral gutter, and there is no nasal sill. In the Caucasian and Neurat skulls, the lower part of the nasal aperture, there is no presence of bilateral guttering, and there is a sharp nasal sill. In the sub-Saharan skull, the nasal aperture is wide or round from top to bottom. In the Caucasian and Neurat skulls, the nasal aperture is triangular and narrow. The mandible, or lower jaw, also displays traits commonly used as indicators of ancestry. For example, the dental arch tends to be V-shaped in Caucasoid populations, while it is more U-shaped or hyperbolic in Negroid populations. This helps explain why a square can be drawn around Neurat's mandible, whereas a more rectangular shape fits the Negroid example. In line with this, the Old Kingdom Egyptian mandible exhibits features typically associated with Caucasoid ancestry. An inferior view of the hard palate also reveals traits used to assess ancestry. This view shows the maxillary bone, palatine process, palatine bone, and dentition. In individuals of sub-Saharan descent, the palate is typically hyperbolic, a long U or rectangular shape with relatively straight sides. In contrast, Caucasian palates tend to be parabolic, with the arms of the U or V shape flaring outward. These dental traits show continuity with Egypt's pre-dynastic populations, such as those inhabitants at Hierakonpolis in southern Upper Egypt. Nuerat was compared with geographically proximate samples, Western Eurasians and Sub-Saharans. The probabilities of Nuerat belonging to West Eurasians is 99%. The probability of belonging to Sub-Saharans is 0.01%. There's no way out of this rabbit hole. Ancient Egyptians were Eurasians like their modern counterparts. Afrocentrism is a notoriously failed ideology. As a side note, it's important to mention as well as provide context for the dental findings from the pre-dynastic cemetery at Hierakonpolis, also known as Nekhen in Upper Egypt. This site predates the life of the Old Kingdom Neurat individual by several thousand years and lies farther south along the Nile. According to the study, the primary objective was to estimate the biological affinities of the pre-dynastic population at Hierakonpolis using both dental and cranial morphometric data. The analysis compared this population with samples from North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and West Eurasia, covering time periods from the post-Pleistocene to the recent era, with a total dataset of 1,950 individuals. Approximately 160 sets of human skeletal remains were examined. HK6, 16 individuals, HK27, 1 individual, and HK43, 60 individuals. These were complete enough for detailed dental morphometric analysis. Phonetic homogeneity was prevalent among the Hierakonpolis inhabitants, and they exhibit dental traits that ally them with other post-Pleistocene populations in Greater North Africa. North Africans have morphologically simple, mass-reduced teeth, a pattern ubiquitous among the samples regardless of distance from the Canary Islands to Egypt and Nubia, or time from 8,000-year-old Capsians to recent Berbers. All of these features are also present in Europeans and West Asians to some degree, but are uncommon in sub-Saharan peoples. Craniometric indicators appear to support these results, and European-like discrete traits, such as alveolar orthognathism, dolichocephaly, rhomboid orbits, narrow nasal aperture, and nasal sill, are prevalent. 21 standard craniometric measurements were taken on 14 of the most complete crania from HK43. The individuals were uniform in cranial size and form, and they show some resemblance to other post-Pleistocene populations of North Africa, as well as Europe and West Asia. They appear distinct from sub-Saharan Africans. The pre-dynastic population of Nekhen resembles North Africans, West Eurasians, and Europeans dentally and cranially, and they are distinct from sub-Saharan Africans. Did you hear that? Pre-dynastic Egyptians as well as the Old Kingdom sample, show continuity, and neither show any affinity with sub-Saharans. Pre-dynastic Egyptians exhibit clear morphological distinctions from sub-Saharan populations. So where is the round nasal aperture typical of TKM's sub-Saharan example? Where is the absence of a nasal dam or sill? Where is the guttering? Can or will TKM ever point us to a sub-Saharan skull that displays these distinct features? No. These hallmark traits are simply not present in sub-Sahara.
None of these things individually makes someone black. Someone can be dolichocephalic and not black.
Remember when he doubled down on his so-called only Africans can be dolichocephalic remark, while literally posting a study based on dolichocephalic East Indian skulls to his audience?
Only Africans exhibit dolichocephaly.
Remember that? He said only Africans, but of course he meant only sub-Saharans. Now we're suddenly greeted with a complete 180. Magically, now anyone can be dolichocephalic. He flip-flops with inconsistencies everywhere, a classic move in pseudo-historic narratives. Using East Indian dolichocephalic skulls as evidence for African exclusivity is a textbook example of cherry-picking and misattribution. The data literally contradicts his assertions. It shows a population outside sub-Sahara, outside Africa, with dolichocephaly. Afrocentrism survives on inconsistencies and lies. The logic is less about rigorous evidence and more about narrative reinforcement. Any contradiction can be glossed over or reframed, while pieces of evidence are co-opted selectively to maintain the overarching claim. It's a bit like trying to patch a leaking boat with duct tape. You know it won't hold under scrutiny, but as long as the story floats, the community keeps rowing.
Someone could have post-pragmatic depression and not be black. Someone can have square orbits and not be black. Someone can have
black hair and not be black. Someone can have brown eyes and not be black. Is this his disclaimer? Oh, tell us something we don't know. Someone can have a triangular nasal aperture and not be black. Oh, that's right. Sub-Saharan blacks do not possess a triangular nasal aperture, a trait which is seen in NUE001 and other ancient Egyptians. Sub-Saharans do not possess Caucasoid characteristics. They just don't. Their populations remained largely isolated thousands of years from Eurasian gene flow. This is why populations like ancient Egyptians, with West Eurasian origins, display cranial and dental traits, as well as hair texture not seen in sub-Saharans.
ended up here. She completely changed the shape of the nose.
Wilkinson's model is a work in progress. Anyone can readily see muscle structures and tissue depth pegs still visible on the face so naturally. Features will change as it moves toward completion.
Has the correct width for the nose, has the rounded tip, has the rounded nares.
None of the sub-Saharan populations carry the full suite of Eurasian haplogroups, a full Eurasian genome sequence, Eurasian dental morphology, and Eurasian cranial traits, not a single one. This is a textbook example of ignoring the complete body of evidence presented in the paper and reducing the argument to cherry-picking a few non-racial markers while discarding all the rest. The Old Kingdom NUE001 individual, cranially, dentally, and genetically, fits squarely in the Eurasian and North African cluster, and there's no reason why it shouldn't. Afrocentric claims require ignoring all three lines of evidence or redefining the word African in ways that erase distinction entirely.
But I've got an African man on the screen, okay? Now, if I put him into a QP-ADM modeling algorithm that only has two sample sets in it, One is
There is no problem with QPADM modeling. This is someone not understanding how QPADM works. Before running QPADM, researchers sometimes use outgroup F3 to see which populatants share the most drift with their target X. Using his example, the formula would be F3 sub-Saharan, X European. Next, we would rotate European out, and the formula would be F3 sub-Saharan, X Chinese. X is rotated through a range of ancient and modern populations. Once potential sources are identified, QPADM then uses F4 statistics to formally test whether the target can be modeled as a mixture of those chosen sources. In short, F3 is a similarity check, while QPADM is a mixture test. His example fails because QPADM modeling does not pit 3 samples against themselves without using outgroups. Next.
is entirely useless outside of the world of racist population geneticists trying to steal history.
Wrong. NUE001's ancestry was compared to world global datasets and tested if he could be represented as a mixture of these sources using allele frequency correlations. Source populations are proposed ancestral groups contributing to the individual's gene pool, while outgroups are used to route the analysis and distinguish between sources. In this case, the authors used hundreds of rotating sources. As they state, it is notable that both, and I place emphasis on the word both, that both our QPADM modeling and admixture clustering excluded any substantial ancestry in the NUE001 genome related to the 4,500-year-old genome from Mota Ethiopia or other, and let me place emphasis on other or other individuals in Central, Eastern or Southern Africa. QPADM is part of the Admix tool suite. Its goal is to model a target population as a mixture of source populations using a set of outgroups or reference populations to control for shared drift. The output is admixture proportions and a statistical fit p-value for the proposed model. QPADM is based on F4 ratio estimation. So in other words, QPADM relies on F4 statistics to evaluate whether NUE001's ancestry could be modeled as a linear combination of the source population's data. The method accounts for shared genetic drift and admixture events. A p-value indicates the model's fit, whereas a low p-value suggests the model is a poor fit. There were hundreds of low p-values indicating no match, and those having no match were included in the supplementary notes but not in the main analysis of the paper. Only a racist could deny irrefutable hard data and then misrepresent that data as a means to promote a false narrative throughout his video and all others. Earlier, he claimed ancient North Africans, Mesopotamians, and Arabians were black people, and seeing how the Old Kingdom individual clusters with these ancient populations. What's the problem? Oh, that's right. Ancient North Africans, Mesopotamians, and Arabians were not black people. That's the problem, just like the data shows, not just this study, but scores of others. His own arguments and inconsistencies completely betrays his so-called science.
Well, think about it. The whole world right now believes that this ancient Egyptian man is 80% Moroccan and 20% Mesopotamian.
Cope. The whole world right now is laughing at every Afrocentric who ever walked the face of the earth. TKM would have everyone believing there can only be 3 datasets, sub-Saharan, European and Chinese, and that QPADM modeling should pick one based on those 3. TKM is deceiving his gullible followers into believing the Old Kingdom Egyptian is something he's not. The haplogroups alone make this indisputable, but TKM would bag a sub-Saharan haplogroup and arbitrarily assign it to NUE001, ignoring actual data. Newsflash, the whole world doesn't belong to a racist ideological faction, hell-bent on usurping ancient civilizations only to replace it with themselves. There is literally nothing in the data that suggests any connection to sub-Sahara. He can't dispute, he's merely casting Cope everywhere.
The inputs of this database are all Eurasian. Remember I showed you this map yesterday? These are the inputs of the database. Okay, so you can see the inputs of the database for the QP-ADM modeling that they used. They did not, in the QP-ADM modeling, put a single African genome apart from the Moroccan ones.
Kenyans from the Late Stone Age, Neolithic, Pastoral Iron Age and Late Iron Age. 201 samples in all, including individuals from Tanzania and Botswana for comparison. It's a major blow to Afrocentrism. QP two-way admixture modelling with East Africans shows that ancient Kenyans, including Dinka, Ethiopians, Congolese and Khoisan Bushmen, consistently failed to cluster with Nurat, regardless of time period or location. None of the samples fit, which is why they weren't included in the main analysis of the paper. So when he claims that the authors didn't include a single sub-Saharan or East African genome or didn't perform two-way admixture modeling with them, he's lying.
Modeling set this bias. I know they were expecting to pick up loads of this Levantine, reaching into this area.
Let's play along with his opinionated nonsense on what he thinks other people think. If they were expecting, and the key word here is expecting, to detect substantial Levantine ancestry, then accusing the authors of being racist, biased, or Eurocentric is completely unfounded. In fact, such an accusation is itself a form of racism. Either way, the Moroccan sample originates from the Middle Neolithic settlement at Skirat Rouazi and is predominantly Levantine. Regardless, it was not 100% North African, and since ancient North Africans are not sub-Saharan, his attempt to argue on behalf of North African genetics is a moot point.
They have an Ethiopian sample, and you'll see that here. The Ethiopian Mota sample, okay, that's dated almost not contemporaneously, about 1,000 years out, okay, but they have an Ethiopian sample.
Mota was included in QPADM admixture modeling, but was not retained in the final analysis because his p-score was too low, as he did not provide a statistically reliable fit, so only the best fit values were used in modeling the ancestry of the Nurat genome. If you recall, he said there were no African samples. Now he admits Mota was used. Again, with the inconsistencies, keep in mind, Afrocentrism exists solely because of contradictions and the lies that sustain them. Admix Tools 2 QPADM Rotate was utilized for Mota, Dinka, Congo Protohistoric, Kenya Late Stone Age, Kenya Neolithic, Kenya Pastoral Neolithic, Kenya Pastoral Elmentetan, Kenya Iron Age Pastoral, Kenya Late Iron Age, Tanzania Pastoral Neolithic, Tanzania Pemba, Tanzania Iron Age, Botswana Early Iron Age, including Levant Chalcolithic and NUE001. This informs us that ancient Egyptians, including Iron Age, Lachish, Natufians, and other Levantine populations, as well as basal Eurasians, do not share affinity with sub-Saharans. Therefore, we are not, quote-unquote, going to be dealing with black people.
Because this is like, in terms of biasing a database, this is beyond biasing it. This is just setting up something exactly as you want the outcome to be. Well, if we don't include any Africans, it can't come out African.
Sub-Saharan samples were used, and the Old Kingdom Egyptian still did not come out sub-Saharan. He's crying foul while conveniently ignoring the fact that sub-Saharan samples were included in the analysis. Further, he hasn't been able to prove any evidence of bias, therefore accusations of bias are utterly baseless, ridiculous, and indefensible. Nurat's genome is Eurasian. It has no bearing on any of the samples, the amount of samples, or their origins. The authors merely compare his genome to other populations to determine origin. Are Afrocentrics upset Nurat's genome is Eurasian, or are they upset that he shows no affinity to sub-Saharans? This is simply him wanting the results to produce a different outcome. And when they didn't, he resorted to lying about the authors and the study. He either read the supplementary material, which clearly lists all the sub-Saharan samples used, and is deliberately deceiving his audience, accusing the authors of not including any sub-Saharan samples, thus exposing his own bias and deceit, or he didn't read it, in which case he has no business commenting on the study at all. And now that he has been shown in this video sub-Saharan samples were indeed included in the study, is he willing to retract his lies and accept the results and come clean? If not, it exposes his bias, racism, and deliberate deceit. Afrocentrics accuse everyone else of what they themselves are guilty of. TKM has made several videos about NUE001, and they're all based on the false premise that the authors did not include sub-Saharan samples in their analysis. Since this premise is demonstrably untrue, every argument he makes is rendered worthless and entirely unwarranted.
You have to, literally, they included everything else apart from the Ethiopian sample. They literally, for this test, the QPADM modeling, they left out the Ethiopian sample. And they only included it here to measure kind of distance or whatever. This is kind of like a test to measure distance from the NUE001. I don't know how this actually works. I'm going to be totally honest.
He doesn't know how this works. In other words, he has no clue what he's talking about. And so the blind lead the blind. F4 statistics are used to analyze allele frequencies in 4 populations or 4 individuals to infer patterns of shared ancestry and/or admixture among them. Figure B's diagram represents an estimation of the best source population responsible for deviation of the NUE001 genome from the Middle Neolithic Morocco group. Motor is included here because he represents the best unadmixed sub-Saharan source responsible for the most positive deviation. He actually hurts the fit the most for a NUE001-like genome. His QPADM F4 stats push the model toward Levant, particularly Mesopotamia Neolithic and North African Neolithic components. In saying that the authors didn't include sub-Saharans is a misleading and deceiving statement as well as false representation of the paper. F4 residuals consistently show NUE001 shares more drift with North Africa, Neolithic Mesopotamia and other Levantines than with any admixed or unadmixed sub-Saharan references. The twin stars on the paper are best fit and therefore best representative of NUE001's ancestry, the first being Morocco Middle Neolithic and Mesopotamia Neolithic. Second best fit is Morocco Middle Neolithic and Zagros Neolithic. Third best fit is Morocco Neolithic and Zagros Chalcolithic. Fourth best fit is Morocco Neolithic and Caucasus Neolithic. Fifth best fit is Morocco Neolithic and Levant Bronze Age. Sixth best fit is Morocco Neolithic and Levant Chalcolithic. The F4 stats for the Old Kingdom NUE001 individual reject a model where he's related to sub-Saharan groups like Motor. Over 200 sub-Saharan samples, Kenya, Tanzania, Botswana, Khoisan, Dinka, were also utilized in the QPADM modeling. They also represent a battery of failed F4 residuals and a low QPADM p-value, and therefore are not seen here. However, they were analyzed and are seen in the supplementary information. Sub-Saharans failed due to low p-values and therefore deemed unnecessary to keep recycling them throughout the rest of the study. Figure A corresponds to Figure B, offering an alternative visualization of the NUE001 genome's best fit ancestry modeling results as determined by QPADM modeling.
NUE001. I don't know how this actually works. I'm going to be totally honest with you. But this is not the QPADM modeling. This is a completely different kind of task that they're completing here.
Figure C is not a different task. It is a map showcasing location results of QPADM modeling as seen in Figure B. This is not rocket science.
There's one reference here where you can see the Ethiopian being included, and that was nothing to do with the QPADM modeling.
So they threw Motor in for kicks. He's listed for a reason. The figure clearly shows Ethiopian motor employed in F4 statistics, exactly where he falls among populations. This is after QPADM modelling was performed. It has everything to do with the QPADM modelling. He's looking right at the data and still chooses to lie and deceive his audience.
Okay, we can read here, ancestry proportion of NUE001 and comparative Bronze Age Levantine Anatolian genomes for the best fit of the
Bronze Age Levantine and Anatolian genomes for the best fit full model. Say it again.
Bronze Age Levantine Anatolian genomes for the best fit.
Say it again.
Bronze Age Levantine Anatolian genomes for the best fit.
Again!
Bronze Age Levantine Anatolian genomes for the best fit.
Now read the next sentence. Pay close attention to the word deviation.
And figure B, estimation of the best source responsible for deviation of the NUE001.
It tells us everything. He gawks right at the figure and still lies to his audience. Ethiopian motor is right there in the F4 stats, clearly shown and positioned among the tested populations. Therefore, he was in fact tested as a possible source, but the fit was statistically poor, meaning his p-value was too low, and his ancestry profile showed the greatest deviation of all. This explains why he was not included in the final admixture map. His appearance in the F4 stats figure still makes sense because that's where they list all populations tested before filtering, and he failed the model fit. There's a reason why motor is included in that figure and not the others. He is the best source responsible for deviation of the NUE001 genome from the Middle Neolithic Morocco group. TKM either read that sentence and failed to comprehend what was being stated, or he understood it and chose to deceive anyway.
There is no inclusion of any Africans, even
Kenyans from the Late Stone Age, Neolithic, Pastoral Iron Age and Late Iron Age. 201 samples in all, including individuals from Tanzania and Botswana for comparison. It's a major blow to Afrocentrism. QP two-way admixture modelling with East Africans shows that ancient Kenyans, including Dinka, Ethiopians, Congolese and Khoisan Bushmen, consistently failed to cluster with NUE001, regardless of time period or location. None of the samples fit, which is why they weren't included in the main analysis of the paper. So when he claims that the authors didn't include a single sub-Saharan or East African genome or didn't perform two-way admixture modelling with them, he's lying.
all it takes is for someone to run this study again and include Motorman and see how different that QP.
Motor was included and run through QPADM dozens of times as a rotating statistic. The data is right there. Motor was tested repeatedly. He simply didn't pass the criteria, which is why he's absent from the data pushing forward. Pretending he was never part of the analysis is pure denial.
Because the level of deception to actually have the genome present and then decide, actually, for our final conclusion, guys, we're going to just remove this African one. That means they've already run it and they didn't like the results they get. I almost
See how this deceitful individual flip-flops and now admits they ran motor in the analysis? They ran motor dozens of times in QPADM in all actuality. They ran hundreds of West, East and South African samples, and the results wrecked the Afrocentric narrative. It's all there in the supplementary material available for everyone to read. All of their p-values were garbage, their deviation was the highest, and they didn't fit the model. TKM sees motor listed and still chose to lie to his audience. That's not ignorance, that's deliberate deceit. TKM and many Afrocentrics built multiple videos on a premise that was dead on arrival. Now they're stuck coping on repeat, pretending sub-Saharans weren't included, spinning lies and inventing conspiracies because the hard data crushed their Black Egypt fantasy.
let's just read this. All accepted QPADM models showed presence of ancestry related to Middle Neolithic Morocco in the NUE001 genome. Therefore, our results could indicate shared ancestry across North Africa during this period.
He reads the results explicitly showing that NUE001 is related to North African Middle Neolithic populations, and yet remains in full denial. The distance from Egypt to Morocco is much further than the distance from Egypt to Ethiopia, and still Mota and all sub-Saharan populations fail QPADM modeling because none of these felt compelled to migrate north. They have absolutely nothing to do with ancient Egyptian state formation or the eras prior to it.
On. Shout out Kamjiverse. Let's put your comment on the screen. He says, Peace King. I ran NUE001 in a few sequences using AI and got
Notice TKM's complete lack of scrutiny. No questioning, no analysis, nothing. He totally accepts this blanket assertion at face value. Absolute lie. AI cannot run QPADM. It can explain the methodology, interpret results, and outline the steps, but it cannot execute the software or compute real admixture models.
They haven't shown you any ancient Egyptian genomes, be it the 26th, the 30th dynasty, or the NUE001 man compared with African groups.
His whole argument collapses instantly as sub-Saharans were in the QPADM runs in relation to NUE001. He just hopes you never read the paper. The cornerstone of his claim that no sub-Saharan samples were run through QPADM modeling with the NUE001 genome is flat out false. The study explicitly included them multiple times, and he either knew and lied or didn't bother to check. Either way, his cornerstone claim isn't just wrong, it's worthless. A pile of rhetoric built on a foundation of sand that crumbles the moment you realize the data is there, and he's made several videos based on this false premise. Look at the QPADM models for ancient East Africans: Kenya Late Stone Age, Early Pastoral Neolithic, Pastoral Neolithic, Pastoral Neolithic, Elmentatan, Iron Age Pastoral, Late Iron Age, Tanzania Pastoral Neolithic, Tanzania Pastoral Iron Age, Botswana Early Iron Age. NUE001 is run in rotating combinations with Dinka, Mota, and Congo dozens of times, and not once does an East African model produce a best fit. F-stats for Levant Chalcolithic was also included. Levantines show no affinity to any sub-Saharan population. This is simply because Levantine populations were not sub-Saharans, they were not black, and Afrocentrics won't be claiming them either.
So they'll show you here a timeline. Once again, you look at the map, you look at the timeline, you'll be like, okay, Africans were included in this entire thing. They weren't included in A.
Deceit, lies, denial, same song, dance and cope. Let's talk about what he conveniently avoided, and you'll see exactly why. Figure 2, top of the paper, NUE001 is projected on a PCA of present-day worldwide populations. Sub-Saharans literally fall off the chart, and yet sub-Saharans were clearly included at multiple points throughout the study. He avoided discussion of Figure 2 for a reason. It shows the process of elimination, which immediately weeded out sub-Saharans at the very start. The PCA makes it obvious. NUE001 doesn't cluster anywhere near them, which is exactly why he didn't address it. This is why any video he makes, especially the ones about NUE001, is built on the lie that no sub-Saharans were run through rotating QPADM modeling in conjunction with NUE001, a claim flatly rejected by the paper itself. Sub-Saharans were included, tested repeatedly, and never once produced a best fit. He knows this, but avoids mentioning it, because it dismantles every single argument he's made. He's got books and shirts to sell based off a lie so he can pocket a dime at the expense of someone else's history.
I'm not sure if I can be bothered to explain PC right now.
This is important. Why do you think he saved the first portion for last? Watch as he scrolls past this critical information, refuses to discuss it, and fails to explain the meaning of the PCA chart to his audience. He can't be bothered. That's because the PCA crushes his fantasy, and this is at the top of the page, setting the tone for the rest of the paper. This is a major part of the study. He refuses to acknowledge or even point out that sub-Saharan populations are at the very bottom of the chart, far, far removed from NUE001 and the Eurasian cluster he shares affinity with. Does he even realize what process these samples went through to get to this point? Process of elimination via QPADM modeling. The NUE001 genome is genetically most similar to present-day people in North Africa and West Asia, which is consistent with the results from admixture clustering. The mitochondrial DNA haplogroup IN1A1B2 and chromosome Y haplogroup E1B1B1B2B, haplogroups of the NUE001 individual, are most common in present-day North African and West Asian groups.
These people be lying, man.
His phony caricature is a virtue signal for fellow racists. He wants you to swallow the idea that an entire army of world-class professionals, PhDs, professors, geneticists, anthropologists, paleoanthropologists, forensic facial reconstructionists, archaeologists, osteoarchaeologists, geoscientists, bioinformaticians, and biostatisticians, people who have dedicated their entire lives to this field, mastering their craft, are secretly colluding to hide the truth, painting them as liars and racists pushing some grand agenda. And then there's Andy, a clown glued to his swivel chair with zero training and zero peer review, has never stepped foot in an ancient genomics lab, never handled a bone sample, never run a single analysis, yet somehow, in his fantasy world, he alone has outsmarted every professional in the field combined. That's right, decades of peer-reviewed science from experts in genomics versus Andy, video rage making from his bedroom. The only lab Andy's ever set foot in is his bathroom. We will trust the PhDs.
This is NUE001 man until they can prove otherwise. This is the...
No, this isn't NUE001. This is a figment of his imagination, a fantasy figure who never existed outside of his own narrative. NUE001 has been demonstrated at length. His biological affinity, cranial morphology, dental traits, and genetic results all point clearly toward a Western Eurasian origin. And the consistency is key. Regardless of the algorithm employed, the results never waver. Estimates of biological affinity based on dental morphological features and cranial measurements parallel the genomic results. A substantial change in odontometric and dental tissue proportions occurred approximately 6,000 years before Common Era, with general continuity thereafter. Hint, hint, this is why Neolithic and A-group Nubians, as well as some C-group Nubians, cluster with ancient Egyptians and not Nilotics in Upper Sudan. In agreement with genetic findings, ancient Egyptians such as NUE001 have dental and craniometric similarities to West Asians. Oh yes, all the information consistently flows accordingly. The mitochondrial DNA haplogroup IN1A1B2 and chromosome Y haplogroup E1B1B1B2B of the NUE001 individual are most common in present-day North African and West Asian groups, consistent with the whole genome affinities. NUE001 is all smiles. So who's the liar? Ancient Egyptian artisans and the authors of the study, or TKM. His phony reconstructions look like they were cobbled together on Microsoft Paint and stick out like a black sore thumb. To cope, he invents excuses. Suddenly, authentic statues and murals are fake. Images are lightened, altered, or whatever contrived nonsense he can dream up to keep the fantasy alive. But none of his cartoonish imposters come remotely close to the precision of real Egyptian craftsmanship or the authentic tones seen in their art. I have included a 4th dynasty reserve head devoid of pigmentation for good measure. Even without colour, the morphological features clearly signal a Western Eurasian phenotype and hence affinity, entirely at odds with his make-believe sub-Saharan imposter. Notice his phony reconstruction is plainly inconsistent with the archaeological and genetic evidence and stands in stark contrast to the authentic artistic and anthropological record. He would turn ancient Egyptians into their Niloitic enemies.